We had been on the preferred vendor list for the better part of a year, but could not get a state GOP to sign with us. And then boom, we were off to the races.
I'm Eric Wilson, managing partner of Startup Caucus, an investment fund and incubator for Republican campaign technology. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, we bring you into conversation with the entrepreneurs who build best-in-class political businesses, the funders who provide the capital, and the operatives who put it all together to win campaigns. Our guest today is Ryun, the founder and CEO of Campaign Sidekick, a voter contact app that is used by campaigns across the country to reach voters on phones, at their doors, over text messages. Any way that you as a voter can be reached, Campaign Sidekick does it. Drew has a long history of working in campaigns, both on the technology side as well as the operative side. Drew, canvassing apps like Sidekick obviously are the most widely used software platforms in campaign tech. It's used by everyone from candidates to campaign staff to volunteers. I'm just wondering, how do you approach creating a product for so many user personas?
That is the Gordian knot, so to speak, that we constantly try and untie, Eric. I think one of the ways that we approached it is, one, always understanding that with Campaign Sidekick, we're doing something complex, right? We're handling in many cases really big data sets that have a lot of auxiliary data points with them, whether it's tags from survey answers, different dispositions that are being hit that aren't necessarily tied to surveys, right? And then how do people actually interact with technology? And we have a saying internally, now externally, as I'm sharing it with you, of as
Exclusive.
simple as we think, right? Yeah, as simple as we think we've made something, maybe it's time we Sesame Street it again, right? It's the idea of something that's very complex, but how do we simplify it? And as I deal a lot with, again, all these different levels of campaigns, right? You've got your volunteers, and for some of them, technology can be a high hurdle, right? How can we as a team, a Campaign Sidekick team, from those that are kind of the external team to the internal team, the guys that do a lot of the devs, our CTO, Darian Raffi, how can we create a technology where the hurdle is low enough that anybody of any ability, any exposure to technology can, in a sense, step over it and become efficient and effective in contacting voters and really create that kind of seamless flywheel of data flow, right? Going and doing the market research, because politics is a consumer business, and really healthy campaigns are doing that constant market research, finding out where their consumers are when it comes to buying the product, the candidate. But then also you've got your power users, right? The folks that want to deal with complex things like modeled universes. And in our case, we have something called a preset filter. How do you group all these different tags and election cycles together into a very granular universe of voters that's then tied into potentially multiple different survey models, so you can do the A/B testing and find that sweet spot of highest contact rate, highest take rate, and then again using that data along the way to create the perfect get out the vote universe. So it's a work in progress, but I do think we have made big steps along the way as we have faced different scenarios.
How much do you benefit from consumers just generally getting better at technology, getting more used to it? I was just thinking about, like, everyone got really good at Zoom because they had no other choice. Do you see that as people become more and more comfortable with, like, you just have to have a smartphone?
Yes and no. I mean, honestly, there's that kind of age-old, well, everybody's always used paper maps and paper walk lists, right? How do we take something that in some people's mind is very complex, right? We're talking about a voter contact app where you can door knock, you can phone bank, you can shoot peer-to-peer texts all in one app. How do you take that, but also embed, so to speak, some old school nature, like paper walk lists, that we can then absorb quickly and kind of meet people where they are? And again, my goal is to kind of make that the edge case, right? That if we have 5 to 10% of our users that still have to be committed to paper for whatever reason, right? They have really bad cell service, or they have no smart device to begin with. And we do face those scenarios, right? It's somewhat of a surprise where I think sometimes those of us inside of the tech space think, well, we handle this on a day-to-day basis. Everybody's got a smart device that can handle our app. And then you get out in the field and you realize, no, that's not always the case. It's yes and no to answer your question. Yeah, we're seeing a lot more people that are very comfortable with technology. We still have that 5 to 10% of the edge cases where our goal is to try and get people out there collecting as much data as possible, because in my mind, data is king in politics, right? And if you use it well, and if you commit to a plan, you're going to greatly enhance your chances of winning an election at whatever level you're running for.
That's a really good point, and it takes a lot of empathy for your users, right? And patience, because
Yes,
the
it
goal is
does.
not to have, oh, we've got this flashy voter contact app and it's going to win awards at the Apple Developers Conference. It's no, you got to win elections, and so
Yeah,
some of that stuff has to take a back seat.
it does. And I think from the beginning with Campaign Sidekick, I really, really emphasized function over form, right? If we're going to present a voter contact app to a broader marketplace, does it accomplish these basic things, right? If you actually go and contact a voter, can you survey them? Does that survey get stored to the system? Is it pushed through whatever API it needs to be pushed through? The idea is, does it actually do what we say it can do? Right. And then along and over the years, we've begun to focus more and more on the actual form of our actual systems, right? Because Campaign Sidekick's only one of our 4 different platforms, kind of the aesthetics of the presentation. But again, I always emphasize the function, right? That somebody has to have a reliable tool if they're going to commit to building a broad base of the campaign pyramid. And I have long argued the broad base of a healthy campaign pyramid is actual grassroots activity, getting out there and doing that direct voter contact. And then everything else builds and narrows up to the top, right up to what you want to spend your money on, whether it's TV ads or not. But when it comes to the broader part of a campaign, you do have to have the ability to come out there and say it works on a day-to-day basis. And I've told my team a lot, look, at times we may not have the flashiest product. Now, so Eric, we're going to roll out version 3 in Q1 of next year, and I'm really excited about that. But it's also, I told my team, I'm like, I want to be boring in one sense, that every time somebody turns on a computer or logs into the app, it's always there and they take it for granted.
I think there's something to be said of just delivering a quality, consistent product that works, because in your case, you've got volunteers that are going out on a Super Saturday. The campaign
Yep.
was able to get volunteers somehow to come give up their Saturday to go door knocking or making phone calls on a weeknight, and it just has to work.
Yeah. And I think too, a lot of campaigns don't understand there are 2 resources they're never going to have enough of. One is time, right? You can have the perfect game plan, but generally speaking, even some of the best campaigns that we've worked with, from Brian Kemp to Glenn Youngkin, you never quite have enough time to fully implement the plan. And the second resource is volunteers. And I think a lot of campaigns, like where we sit as Campaign Sidekick, kind of in the middle of those 2 components, the actual campaign and the volunteers, is making sure that we're the conduit that does not create frustration.
Right. You hope people don't notice you. And one of the reasons
Correct.
that you're able to work with so many campaigns across the country is that Campaign Sidekick is a preferred vendor with the Republican National Committee.
Mm-hmm.
Explain what that means and how you earn that designation, because it's something that a lot of our founders that we work with are interested in and want to know more about.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, just giving you kind of more of a personal story of how I got here. It was something where I had been a deputy political director at the Republican National Committee. It had started in 2002, before I was actually even in the building, where we had been trying a brand new product at the time called Voter Vault. And my soon-to-be boss, Blaze Hazelwood, and a friend of mine, Timmy Teeple, who was her deputy, said, hey, we need some folks to field test this for us. So I was actually put out in a special election in Missouri, Jim Talent versus Gene Carnahan. And so here's kind of the step process along the way. One, at that point, I realized there's got to be a better way to do this. This is before the advent of the smartphone, so forth and so on. We were definitely paper walk lists and paper maps. 04, had a great time in the building. And then really kind of in the back of my mind was percolating, there's got to be a better way to do this. And really kind of the genesis of this was started in 2011. When I had the chance to become involved in what became Campaign Sidekick, eventually bought out my partners. And it was the idea of, okay, how do we actually go prove this in the field, right? How do we, in a sense, fail quietly off the radar screen and then fight our way through the trenches? Because, yeah, I mean, having been a former deputy and political at the Republican National Committee, yeah, I definitely had a network and I had people I could connect with. There is a generational flow, by the way, at the RNC, right? Camps come and go. But I just committed with my team that at that point, there's really 4 of us. Now we're up to 24. Was the idea of, we're going to put the best product out in the field. We're going to fight our way through the trenches. And then in 2018, something spectacular happened, kind of 2 things. We got Brian Kemp's campaign in Georgia. And I loved it because they had the 3 components that I always am looking for. One, they had a staff committed to grassroots. They had a great product, happened to be us, Sidekick. And they committed to some really good data sets that WPA Intel had put together. We ended up winning that campaign. We also were part of the DeSantis IE down in Florida, did 1 million doors over 6 weeks. And suddenly I had two friends, Chuck Warren and Matt Pinnell, who's now the Lieutenant Governor of Oklahoma. They're like, look, you really need to go meet with the Republican National Committee and see if you can actually do a field test and become one of their preferred vendors, because your product actually has what it takes to become a preferred vendor for voter contact. And the RNC is always looking for new products that can, in a sense, be market standard, also can be best of breed, right? And kind of keep the marketplace competitive. So we went through that process, and really it was kind of funny, Eric. We got on the preferred vendor list and nobody had ever heard of me, because again, it's that generational flow inside of the Republican National Committee. And out of the blue, Ken Nunnenkamp, who's now the executive director at the Virginia GOP, he was the data director for the North Dakota GOP. And I got a random phone call from him at the end of 2018. And he said, hey, we're looking for a new solution. And we signed the North Dakota GOP. And that was our kind of our breakthrough moment, that we had been on the preferred vendor list for the better part of a year, but could not get a state GOP to sign with us. And then boom, we were off to the races, starting with the North Dakota GOP.
So preferred vendor list means that you meet the minimum standards. Like you go through some security testing and things like that.
You go through testing. You've got to make sure that you can handle the RNC's API. They actually put you out in the field where you do have somebody in the building watching the data flow coming in. There's some tweaks along the way. And then in the end, either you pass or you don't pass. And we passed, and here we are.
And so I think I do want to highlight that for our listeners, Drew, because I hear it a lot from first-time founders or people who might be new to politics. They say, oh, well, why don't we just sell to the RNC and get a contract and make every Republican in the country use it? And you and I both know that that's not how this process
That's not how it happens.
And your answer just sums that up, right? Because it's 10 years of an overnight success.
Which is funny. A buddy mentioned that to me probably about 3 years ago. He's like, Drew, I think, and he's nowhere near politics, to be honest with you. He's actually a surgeon here in Fort Worth, where I live. He's like, I just get the sense you're about to break through, and suddenly everybody's going to think you're an overnight success, except I've been here the first 7 years and seen how you've kind of worked through the trenches, right? And it's been touch and go. I mean, and it was touch and go, right? And I think some folks have asked me, like, what does it take to be successful as an entrepreneur? I mean, there's a lot of things, right? Some are going to sound pretty cliche, like you got to believe in yourself. Well, you do. You actually do have to believe that you have been created with a certain talent set and have that absolute belief that you are the person that can do it. But I think kind of when it boils down to, Eric, it was, I just refused to concede. I refused to concede that I couldn't be the one that provided a solution. I refused to concede that Campaign Sidekick couldn't be successful. And I nailed that flag to the mast, and I'm like, I'm going down with the ship one way or the other. And it worked.
So for a long time, door knocking and phone calls have really been the gold standard in terms of voter contact. You know, that's what those paper walk lists and maps were about. And then we digitized that. Texting in the last couple of years has really given campaigns a little bit of a lifeline. But of course, we're even seeing voter contact rates just decline across the board, including text messages. How are you helping your customers deal with these changes?
Well, I think one, you have to be able to provide as many solutions as possible, right? It's kind of that full revolution of how you look at a voter. How can you contact them? Which kind of goes to that market research concept, right? You've got to find the consumers where they are, the issues that motivate and mobilize them. Then you got to kind of find the medium that they want to be contacted through. Is it getting a knock at the door? Is it a phone call? Is it a landline? Is it a cell phone? Or do they just want to receive a text? You know, interestingly enough, we are seeing, in a sense, a degrading of voter contact, especially over landlines, right? This isn't something new. This has kind of been coming for the last few election cycles. But I will say this, I mean, I look at a lot of our major clients, and the door contact rates, you know, the takes are staying right between 20 and 25% of canvassing. What I do see is kind of peer-to-peer coming into overtake phone calls as kind of the second best way to contact voters. But again, you know, after knocking on the door, there is kind of a drop off on what your contact rate and then what your canvas rate is. And then that creates kind of volume, right? You have to have enough volunteers or enough staff to create the volume of outbound contacts that collect the data points that you need to either then confirm the model data sets that you're working on, right? Or challenge the presuppositions, tweak those models, bring them back out in the field, and again, go do more and more market research. So, to answer your question, yeah, we are seeing a drop-off rate on phone calls. Texting, we'll see how texting goes over these next two election cycles, right? 22 and 24. The old standby, the traveling salesman model of door to door, continues to hold steady. Is it going to blow people out? Amaze them? No. Is it going to be steady along the way? Yes.
I think that there's more potential even with door knocking, because with all these smart doorbells, I think if you are sending people out into the field today, you need to have a script. So if you see the Nest or the Ring, you ring it and you assume that someone's going to come back and watch it later and say, "Hi, I'm so-and-so. I'm a volunteer from such and such." Because that's just, sort of like screening people at your door.
It is, and it takes a certain amount of creativity out in the field. And that's something that I challenge our team with internally of, a lot of us have a lot of door knocking experience, right? I do think that has been extremely valuable. I like to think that a lot of my experience over the years at the doors with paper walk lists, with paper maps, has in a sense worked its way into the DNA of Campaign Sidekick, right? But I do think the successful teams in this day and age are the ones that are creative in the ways that they actually contact voters, and they're prepared for every scenario. That then, coming back onto the Campaign Sidekick team, is we then have to give them the ability to be creative with the tool sets that we provide.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that, we're on these panels all the time, and people try and frame it as a conflict of, is it all door knocking or is it all phones? But
it's everything.
I think Campaign Sidekick takes the view it's all of the above, and you get a voter where you get a voter.
Correct. And I think when you look at the commodity of politics, right, it's actual votes. Our role is to help campaigns get as many votes as possible by giving them a seamless set of tools that are easy for their end users, right? And again, I always harp on that point is, when we look at the Campaign Sidekick app, and I was looking at it again this morning, I always look at our app and I'm always kind of fiddling around with, how do we make this easier? Are there too many steps in this one process? How can we actually simplify it? I think we're always looking to make it an easier and easier experience. But I will say, one of the things that I'm actually looking at, a note from an older volunteer, it's pinned on my whiteboard. There's an 85-year-old volunteer in New Jersey who loves our phone bank, and she's made over 40,000 phone calls this election cycle already through Sidekick. So
I hope you've given her like a t-shirt or something.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the picture she sent me is her wearing her Campaign Sidekick t-shirt and her Campaign Sidekick hat that I had mailed to her when I saw somebody post on social media her making phone calls on Campaign Sidekick. And I reached out to some friends that I thought would know. I'm like, who is this and how old is she? And I think for me, that is a measure of success, right? That's how I measure our success. If we can get older volunteers who have far more years of experience than I do of knocking doors and making phone calls, and if I can get them comfortable with the technology that's plugged into an API, or again, that seamless flywheel of data, where they're playing an active, engaged role in this market research, directly contacting voters, grabbing those answers, bumping it up against the model that they're in. Do we need to change the script? Do we need to challenge the presuppositions inside of the modeled universe and then roll it back out in the field? If I can get 70, 80-year-olds who are comfortable with technology, that to me is a massive measure of success for us.
One of the things that we've seen the Democrats investing more time and resources in is relational organizing, which is kind of an umbrella term for a number of different tactics. But we haven't seen as much widespread adoption by Republicans. There's sort of efforts here and there. How do you think the right is going to incorporate these strategies into our campaigns?
Oof, that is a question I've been noodling on for the better part of 10 years. As I share with a lot of grassroots folks when I do these trainings, and I'd love to go out in the field and train grassroots and meet with campaigns. I said, look, here's the difference between us and the left. The left, the Democrats, however you want to define them, think of it as preseason football, right? They have been practicing. They've got their game ready. When the whistle blows, suddenly they have the football inside of our red zone, right? They've organized. They're ready. They're in midseason, if not postseason form. Whereas a lot of times Republicans, conservatives, we think a lot of this voter contact doesn't start until Labor Day. I was like, that's basically getting a touchback and having to march 75 yards, doing a 2-minute drill and hoping that we're going to win. I do think part of it is kind of a cultural thing. The left, for them, politics is life. for a lot of Republicans and conservatives, especially those that view it as limited government conservatives, fiscal conservatives. Politics and government are necessary evils, right? We have to engage, we have to get the right people elected, but it's not something that we want to be doing on a day-to-day basis. So I do think it's kind of a worldview, how we approach these things, Eric.
Yeah.
Can we do some things better? Absolutely. One of the things that I try and talk with about campaigns is it's constant campaigning, right? Especially for elected officials. Once you win a campaign, sure, take a few weeks off, take a couple months off if you want to, and then get back to constituent services, right? Using technology and being able to go out and interview constituents on the issues of the day and finding out where they are, and constantly having those touches inside of the precincts. Politics isn't that hard, Eric. It is constant, though, and it does take work. And as I tell a lot of folks, there's no silver bullet in politics, right? It's doing the fundamentals and doing them well. And for us with Campaign Sidekick, it's giving that, again, that tool set of here's how we can make you effective and efficient on the ground, doing the fundamentals well, doing that market research, direct voter contact, and winning. And it's that simple sometimes.
You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Ryun, the founder and CEO of Campaign Sidekick. We're talking about his experience building a voter contact application and his journey along the way. Drew, I'm really curious to hear, you were a political operative before making the switch to entrepreneur. What was the most impactful lesson that you learned as you made that journey?
Oof, that's a great question. Probably a longer answer than you're looking for, but let me just kind of give you a little background. My dad ran.
We do not pay by the minute here. So.
Yeah, it's fine. My dad ran in 3 Olympics. He held 6 world records, and I remember in my 20s, before I actually worked for the Republican National Committee, he's a fantastic public speaker, and I heard him give a talk to a really large running camp, and it was about making the impossible possible. And that was really something that resonated with me over the years of how do you take something that seems impossible, and that is a broad adoption of a technology platform, to potentially a culture that is not prepared for it, right? Because let's be honest, our side of the aisle, our volunteers tend to be a little bit older and maybe not as technology friendly as the other side. I think for me, though, there was kind of a moment of just saying, I'm going to go prove a point, where as an English and history major, I hold 2 degrees from the University of Kansas, not poli-sci. I have no technology background. I knew politics. And the funny thing is, Eric, I hated math. But the first time in the field, I realized I had a knack for political math. I could actually crunch precincts and I could figure out which ones we needed to hit, how many times we needed to hit. And then suddenly there was the idea of what if I take all of this knowledge base and fuse it to a technology system? But really kind of the biggest thing was I wanted to prove a point that I could actually do it. And then I think a breakthrough moment for us was, again, something that I've referenced already. It was the DeSantis, i.e. the independent expenditure, where I felt comfortable enough going into that election in 2018, where we did something big the night before the election that frankly could have blown up in our faces, but I felt confident in our dev team that I even told my team, I'm like, guys, if we pull this off, we're writing our ticket for the future. And I think for me, taking calculated risks along the way, knowing what I could accomplish and what was just beyond my reach. But if I plugged ahead, that whatever I thought was outside of my reach, eventually I could achieve. I think that's probably been the biggest lesson for me, is always willing to kind of push the envelope with calculated risk and finding out where my abilities begin and end, and finding if there is a way to actually exceed the abilities I've been created with.
That is a really great answer, and it encapsulates something that I see all the time. And I have to overcome this as an investor, as someone who advises startups. You have to overcome the curse of knowledge, right? So I've seen all the ways it can't be done, how hard it is. And so if we all thought that way, nothing would ever get done. So it's really a great way to articulate the sort of irrational belief you have to have in yourself and your ability to accomplish something in order to be successful as a startup founder.
Absolutely. And I think it has served me well. I do know in the back of my mind, there is a point, like it's something that you grow along the years, right, Eric, that eventually I know I'm going to hit the limits of what I'm capable of. And I do think that it's an awareness of going, you know what? I am a smart guy in the room. And I fully believe that in myself, right? But I'm not the only smart guy in the room. And it's the ability, and I would hope to say the humility to turn to somebody else and say, I think I've hit the limit of my abilities. Here's what I'm trying to accomplish. Can you help me out? And I think for me, there actually did come that moment a couple of years ago, and I turned to a friend, and he had been somebody that had been meant a lot to me, Darian Raffi, and he's now my chief technology officer. And I basically said, I'm kind of hitting a roadblock on Campaign Sidekick, and I would love it if you could come officially on board and we can kind of hammer out the details. And I really have viewed that as kind of a seminal moment for me of being able to say, look, I'm not an idiot, but I'm going to need some other smart people on the team that can help me get this the rest of the way.
Right. Drew, I want to shift gears for just a minute, because one of the things that I'm sure you have to deal with and is, there's the cyclical nature of politics when we're talking about revenue and cash flows. This has to be a big challenge for someone like you, where you're relying on these big, it's campaign season. We're doing all the voter contact. I'm curious just to hear how you address that with Campaign Sidekick.
I am obsessed with my profit and loss sheet, to be honest with you. I make sure that every month we're putting money away for the lean. There's really 6 lean months after an election cycle, but there's also opportunities when I think politics is one of the greatest petri dishes out there, right? You can do a lot of testing, experimenting, see what works. And then you have the opportunity to kind of broaden your own marketplace and go into other sectors that could be directly connected to politics, or frankly, not even connected to politics in any way, but based in the technology that you've created. So yeah, it was probably a bigger tension point for me in the early years of Campaign Sidekick. We're going to get this rush of cash, and then I've got to make that last for 6 months, paying servers, paying devs, paying the team. Now it's not as big in the sense we don't have as high of peaks and as low of valleys. And a lot of that is tied to using election cycles to expand, in a sense, our technology library, our offerings that we can then sell and continue to maintain, but also increase profit in the off season. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a tension point for everybody in politics, because no surprise, especially over the last 6 months of an election season, there is significant cash flow when you've positioned yourself well. It's managing that money going forward, and 2, it's also finding other ways that you can create different pipelines of profit.
Right. So 2 lessons there. One, when you get that big paycheck, don't go out and buy a boat or a Lamborghini, because you're going to need that for a while. And the other thing to potential investors listening is it's actually not that big of a challenge. I think it's sort of oversized in a lot of people's mind. I was at a conference and another startup founder mentioned that some people are surprised that they think elections happen only once every 4 years when we elect a president. So that is really interesting to hear that, you manage it and it's actually not as big of a challenge. Drew, I'm curious to hear, if you weren't working on Sidekick, what's a problem facing campaigns that you'd want to tackle with a startup, or maybe you want to invest in a startup?
This is a great question. I think one of the things that I'm looking for is, and again, it maybe we provide the solution. I don't think a lot of elected officials do very well using technology when it comes to pure constituent services. Mm-hmm. It's something where, campaign is the time that we contact voters. Your voters are your constituents. And I do think that there is a vehicle, there is a legitimate profit model for folks to be able to, use something in technology for constituent services that potentially rolls right into their campaign election season. I think that's one thing. I think 2, I've always been fascinated with different components inside of technology of, 1, pure automation of voter contact. It could be IVRs, it could be voicemail delivery, it could be, who's responding to what texts. Is this a bot? Is this a live person? I think there's so many things that we're still exploring inside of Campaign Sidekick to refine the model, even as good as we are right now, right? I always tell the team, we can be better, and we're competing against ourselves. There's probably something that I'm not even thinking of right now, Eric, that we'll be able to accomplish within the next 2 election cycles.
I want to thank Drew for joining us today on the Business of Politics show. Please remember to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and share this episode with a friend if it made you just a little bit smarter. One of the best ways that you can help the show, if you've been listening for a while, is to go onto Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Actually say, I really enjoy listening to this. That really helps with getting more people to listen and let people know that this community of entrepreneurs and technologists is out there and that we are working hard to help win elections. And with that, we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.